I see the number of attendees ticking up. I'll just give the system a second to catch up before we begin. Okay, Polly, everything look good? Are we ready to begin?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon or this morning or this evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And we have participants and attendees from all over the world. My name is Jeremiah Johnson. I'm an associate professor at North Carolina State University, and I'll be moderating this panel. First of all, I'd like to thank Polly Yan at Stanford and Addie Keskar from North Carolina State University for supporting this panel series. John Wyatt and Ben Leibowitz for their support for the Macro Energy Systems Group more generally, and all the participants who have joined today. The Macro Energy Systems Group has defined this emerging field and research community as one that focuses on large-scale, systems-level, long-term aspects of energy systems and their implications for other systems. And part of that right there, that long-term aspect of energy systems brings to bear that we need to understand how technologies evolve and change over time. And so that was kind of how this panel came to be. It raises difficult but important questions around uncertainty, around technological change, around innovations, and how these factors can and should play into macro energy systems modeling, and by their very nature, be addressed into our modeling capabilities. We are very fortunate to have three distinguished scholars here who have agreed to participate in this panel discussion. The way that I'm going to run this, I'll provide very brief bios. I'll ask for short opening remarks, and then we'll jump into a question and answer session with some questions led by me. But I'll be sure to preserve 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the event for questions from attendees that you can type in your questions, and then I will ask the panelists. The three panelists we have today, let me first introduce Professor Erin Baker. She joins us from UMass Amherst, where she is a distinguished professor in industrial engineering and operations research and the faculty director of the Energy Transition Institute. Erin's research focuses on decision-making under uncertainty with a particular focus on energy justice, and environment. Our second panelist, Professor Eric Hittinger from the Rochester Institute of Technology, where he is an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy. Eric's research focuses on electricity system policy, operation, and economics, with a particular focus on understanding benefits and limitations of energy storage and renewable energy technology. And our third panelist today, Dr. Arnulf Grubler. Arnulf has worked with IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, since the 1970s. He is currently emeritus there. And in his time, he served as senior research scholar in several groups, including the Integrated Assessment and Climate Change Group, among others. Arnulf served for some time as a faculty member at the Yale School for Environment, where I actually took classes with him many years ago. And some of the stuff I teach now is heavily influenced by Arnulf. He has served as a lead author and a review editor for multiple IPCC assessment reports. So thanks again for these panelists agreeing to share their time and their expertise. I'm going to ask an open-ended question to provide an opportunity for some brief opening remarks from each panelist, and I'll ask Erin if she would be willing to go first. And the question that I'll ask all three panelists are, you accepted our invitation to speak on this topic of technological uncertainty and game-changing technology developments in energy modeling. Why do you think this topic is worth your time and attention?
Right. Thank you very much. So technological change means that addressing climate change may be less difficult and less costly than we think it will be, and that it may be actually even more broadly socially beneficial. And so we've seen this. We've seen other examples like the Clean Air Act in the US, which turned out to be much less expensive than people had predicted. And we've seen recent technological change way beyond predictions. And so it's important to think about that. At the same time, we also do not want to assume the climate change problem away by assuming there's some kind of miraculous technical change out there that's going to solve everything. We clearly need climate policy, and I believe that innovation also needs leadership and policy. So we have to think very carefully about it and not just assume there's this magical technical change. So I've worked on government-funded research and development, and that requires thinking about the question of what to fund, when, where, how, requires us to dive into the details of technologies. We really need to understand, say, the relative value of R&D into solar, batteries, advanced nuclear, and we may even want to understand the difference between different directions we can go for nuclear, purely organic or doubling down on traditional solar. And we need to understand the impact on the economy and the energy system of these technologies. And so that's where the modeling really comes in. We need to understand how they're competing in the economy and what it means. More recently, I'm interested in social justice and energy transitions. And this also requires an understanding of specific technologies, how they may evolve, how they could evolve, and how they respond to policy and regulations. So an example there is, can carbon capture evolve in a way that could benefit marginalized communities rather than simply allow current injustices to continue? And so you need to have a little bit of understanding of carbon capture and where it's going to go. And then finally, I'm very interested in coming up with rigorous, explicit ways to synthesize multiple models that have different assumptions and different worldviews. Because I think if we can synthesize multiple models like that, we can do a better job at capturing the really wide range of possibilities out there for technological change. Okay? And I'm also interested in methods for incorporating and communicating uncertainty in technological change. And so with there, I will hand it off.
Thank you so much, Erin. I think a lot of that response really resonated and was really the motivation for why we organized this panel. Thank you for that really nice kickoff. Eric, so why do you think that this topic of technological uncertainty, game-changing technology developments, and energy modeling is worth your time and attention?
Yeah, so I think, as a person who uses technological progress in energy modeling, I was thinking more focused on how we integrate this into models. So if you're a modern energy modeler and you feel like you're doing a pretty good job, you might say, oh, I'm going to put in a learning curve, technological progress learning curve for, solar, wind, batteries, right? And make it endogenous in my model. So as I adopt solar, they feed it through a learning curve and the price comes down. And, I've done this and said, wow, I'm doing a great job. But I think it's ripe for disruption. I think this way of modeling, there is some potential for really interesting expansion to the way that we think about how we model these things. So an analogy that comes to mind is, and I think this audience will be pretty familiar with the question of discount rate and time, time preference, generally speaking, when making climate change decisions. So once upon a time, we had a nice simple tool, discount rates. You could calculate net present value of things. It's one equation. It's really easy to apply to any costs and benefits. And it was very straightforward for modeling purposes. But, through several different avenues, but I think most focused on climate change questions, we've really tried to reevaluate that relationship with discount rates. Like, what really is a discount rate? Is it the same for all people in all places? We have things like hyperbolic discount rates. We have different discount rates for different types of decisions. And we've really unpacked the idea of time preference, right? I think we all still believe that we have time preference, that some kind of discounting applies, but we've kind of exploded what was once a simple, straightforward equation into a lot of more sophisticated ideas that also can be applied analytically. And I think the same thing can happen for learning curves. And I think it's ripe for disruption, especially by people in this space that, we have learning curves and say, oh, every time solar doubles, the price of solar panels comes down 22% or whatever. But, to what degree is that causal? Like, is it really as directly causal as we would like it to believe in our models? To what degree is it regional, right? Does that apply internationally? Does that apply nationally or locally? And to what degree can we apply this to every technology? And I think there's interesting questions in this space that will let us take what is a functional but simple view of technological progress, learning curve, one equation, easy to include in our models, into a space where we're trying to understand the subtleties in the way that this process works, and hopefully get more sophisticated modeling tools out of it, so that we can get better answers out of the models we use.
Thank you, Eric. I love that analogy with the discount rate. That's great. Arnulf, you spent tremendous amount of time in your career on this topic. Why?
Well, I always have been interested in history and in understanding complex systems. So that's my entry point. And in doing I'm also an old empiricist, so doing careful historical analysis of past pervasive transitions, I've come to appreciate the importance of technological change. Now, technological change is a larger phenomenon than simply a power plant. We speak of technology systems, interrelated technologies. Now, in my research, what I have learned is that we tend to ignore the dominant technology space in the energy sphere. Everything is dominated by end-use technologies, installed capacity, investments, employment, efficiency improvement potentials. It's all there in the end use and not in the supply. This has been historically the case for every pervasive transition, and it will be, in my viewpoint, also the case in future transitions. Where is this in the energy models? I hardly see it. All the end use is somehow relegated into a simple assumption. Or in sectorial models, you have vehicle choice models, technology choice models, whereas we actually should have behavioral-driven mobility choice models, modal split choice models, and not technology purchase models. So this is a holy grail, I think, and a vast area of improvement, if we can manage it. Much more than the technicalities of how we're dealing with time preferences and heterogeneity, which is another big topic here. Not only the technologies are heterogeneous, but the entire landscape around it is very, very heterogeneous. So from my perspective, what I hope we can discuss a little bit more is when we talk about game-changing innovations and what are the possible drivers for these and what are the potential impacts of these changes, that we're not restricted only to fancy sky dream things, the next generation of small scale, super cheap modular nuclear reactors. We've heard this for 50 years. We are going to hear it for another 50 years, okay? Or solar power satellites beaming down solar electricity generated from outer space with microwave radiation to the Earth. Well, if a hacker attacks the satellite, you don't want to be living in a city where the microwave beams onto the city. So I think, it would be more interesting to look at radical changes in the way how we use technologies to satisfy our service needs that we derive from energy, rather than just looking at how we provide this energy.
Point well taken, Arnulf. And many of us in this community are engineers, not all, but many, and many find understanding the thermodynamics very comfortable, understanding the human response very uncomfortable, and so point well taken. I guess the first specific question that I have, I'd like to direct to Erin. So Erin, you have been part of several influential studies that surveyed industry experts on technologies such as wind power, such as batteries, such as electric vehicles, to better understand future costs and technological advancements. I was hoping that you could speak a bit about the benefits and the drawbacks of using expert opinions in this manner, and any best practices perhaps that you could offer for those wishing to use this approach or use the output of such studies.
Sure, but actually, if I can first just respond a little bit to Arnulf's comment, I thought that was great. And just because I remembered I'd forgotten to say something, so there's the end use in general. There's also what I would call civic innovation and organizational innovation, and I think both of those things are equally as important as technological innovation, and I think it's kind of related to Arnulf's point. So back to the question, yeah, so this is kind of what I do, gathering expert opinions and figuring out how to use them. And so the benefits of expert opinion, as opposed to like purely kind of empirical data-based forecasts, are a couple of things. One is, for R&D, it's really important. If we want it to be conditional on explicit R&D expenditures, that is very hard to do from past data. You need to be thinking about how things might change in the future. And then the differentiation between technologies becomes a little bit tricky if you're just trying to use data. Whereas if we're looking at, again, like an investment into purely organic solar cells versus investments into other types of solar, that's really hard to get any place except from experts. So there are certain things, certain kinds of forecasts that really don't exist except from experts. Now, importantly, that is the only time you want to use expert judgment. People have a tendency to want to use expert judgment as if it's some kind of a shortcut or something. It is not a shortcut. It has a lot of problems to it. So if data exists, you should always use data. You should never ask experts for something that you can use data for. You should only use experts when you're really wanting to forecast these kind of step changes, right? I mean, if we want to understand huge changes in the future in technology, you really need to rely on experts. But if you don't have to rely on them, you shouldn't, because there's a lot of, it's also incredibly time consuming to do it correctly. But the biggest thing that we've seen recently is that experts are very much looking like they just regularly underestimate the potential of technological change. That's kind of interesting because, 10 years ago when I was giving talks about this, everybody always raised their hand. But aren't the experts over-optimistic about their technology? I mean, that was my constant question. And now I can say very clearly, nope, they are not over-optimistic about their own technology they work on. We've seen this, I've done work on offshore wind, Greg Nemitz work on solar, that nice battery paper, I'm forgetting who that was, but Laura Diaz-Anadon, Elena Verdolini did a study. So, I mean, we've seen that these technologies are doing better than the experts predicted. We have a little bit of an idea about why, that it's much easier to think about the way that things can go wrong than the way that things can go right? Because the way that things can go wrong, you look at what's out there and you're like, oh, it might fail this way, and that way. There's an infinite number of ways that things can go right, and that's hard for experts to think about. And another thing is that humans, and this includes kind of scientists and economists, we're not good actually at cumulative reasoning. That means we have a really hard time in our heads understanding the buildup of cumulative capacity. And so I think people tend to underestimate what the cumulative capacity is and underestimate then the impact on technological change. And so I think what I would like to see is a little more research into forecasts, because I think there are times when you want an expert forecast. So I would like to see some research into this. And so like Max Henrian has suggested that we should be explicitly combining learning curves and expert judgment. I mean, he suggested we have experts elicit the learning rate. That to me seems very difficult. But I think there's ways of like training people on learning curves and cumulative capacity and giving them a sense of where we would expect to go if things just followed business as usual, and then have them, try to figure out how to work around that. As well as, I mean, I think what Eric was saying, clever, interesting ways to use learning curve or database type analysis to inform things like R&D portfolios. So yeah, and so yeah, if you want to do your own expert opinion study, I just ask you, please call somebody who knows what they're doing. I cannot tell you how many papers I review of people that say they did an expert opinion survey, you know, and they did a survey that's completely unrigorous. So please, just for a favor to me, just don't do it without getting some help from decision analysis people. And how to use them, I think use them with humility, like everything else, right? That would be my main suggestion there. So I will finish that.
Point well taken, Erin. One quick follow-up on this. So in the spaces where data do not exist and the expert opinions can be quite useful, which experts? So when we talk about experts, are we talking about experts in academia? Are we talking about those in industry who are trying to get the technology off the ground? Are we talking about everybody who's working in the space? Is there a variety of expert that you go to for these studies that are most suitable and have the expertise to offer what you need?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of what sector they're in, we generally would like to try to cover the different sectors. But there's a more specific question, which is very tricky on which expert. So, because the expert has to not only understand the technology, they really have to have some ability to answer these questions about probability and forecasting. And I think there's more and more evidence that, like, it's one of those things, like some people are just good at forecasting and other people aren't. And so that's, so it's really trying to figure out, is this person not only an expert in the technology, but can they actually get their head around this multiplicity of possibilities in the future? So in some ways more important than like whether you go to industry or whether you go to academia. I mean, in general, we try to cover both, but it's really getting individuals who have an ability. They're hard questions. They're very hard questions to answer. Some people just cannot get their head around it, right? They just can't. So you need to find people who can, and hopefully have some understanding of a somewhat deep understanding of probability. So that's actually, I think, more important than the sector.
Point well taken. Thank you. Changing gears a little bit, Eric, you have a recent study that examines two opposing forces. One of which is increased deployment leading to lower costs. The other of technologies such as wind and solar. The other being the increased penetration of these technologies on the grid leads to decreasing value of the next wind turbine that goes in. Could you briefly explain this phenomenon and then help us understand how this can or should or could be used when we talk about macro energy system modeling?
Yeah, so I'll actually tackle that in reverse, and I'll say the research that we've done there, and we've actually had a couple other similar topics. So we've done a similar thing for electric vehicles and some end-use appliances, efficiency for appliances, things like that. But what we've been interested in is the idea of heterogeneity, that there's different types of consumers, there's different types of places where you can put wind farms or solar farms, and they each have their own properties. Some places are better than others. Some people will pay more for a technology than others because they get more use out of it or more benefits out of it. And how that heterogeneity might interact with technological progress, that as we build more solar panels, solar gets cheaper. As we sell more electric cars get cheaper. So can you get what has been called cascading diffusion? I love that term, but can you have a situation where early adopters who get a lot of value out of the technology and are willing to pay more for it will buy the technology, bring down the costs for other consumers, that then makes it attractive for a broader market. And then those people will buy into the technology, and then it becomes even cheaper for an even broader market. And if things go well, you get what's called cascading diffusion, that the new technology takes over the market. And that's a thing that's been known certainly qualitatively. And what we've been trying to do is do quantitative analysis to get at that question. Do we think this would work? So with the wind and solar paper, what we did is look at the US and the potential for wind and solar in electricity grids, and also got a sense of how wind and solar kind of cannibalize their own revenue. So, as you said, each additional solar farm that goes up kind of cuts into the revenue to all the existing solar farms. The benefit of an additional unit of solar when you have a lot of solar already tends to be lower. You wish that energy would be delivered at another time, presumably from another technology. So as you add more and more solar to a grid, the value of each additional solar farm or megawatt or whatever your measure is tends to go down a little bit. But on the other hand, as we build more and more solar, the price of solar we expect to go down as well. And so what we tried to do was a quantitative measurement of how do we expect these two trends to sort of play out and which one is faster. So ideally, you would like the cost of solar to fall faster than the revenue or benefit from solar tends to fall. And what we found for wind and solar is, so it was funny, it was tough to do the messaging for this. And I think we hit the right note, but sort of a mixed messaging that in general, the benefits and the costs tended to fall in parallel approximately, which meant that the net benefits wouldn't be a lot better than they were today, even with the falling costs of wind and solar. That's probably not that bad because, in my opinion, wind and solar are not particularly over expensive today. So if we ended up stuck at today's perspective for a long time, that would be fine. But the other thing that we didn't take into account, and we titled this paper "Learning is Not Enough" very intentionally, is all the complementary technologies, energy storage, demand flexibility, and just rearrangement of electricity grids, which would make it easier to include wind and solar. So learning on its own won't take us to this magical land of cheap energy. We've actually, with electric cars, we found a slightly more positive story. When we did a similar kind of analysis for electric cars, we actually did find more cascading diffusion and better prices coming down faster and being more attractive to additional markets, and that market probably growing quickly over the next decade or two.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. This idea of cascading diffusion is exciting and daunting to think about within a modeling context as well. Arnulf, so I've led this discussion, very much toward through a technology focus, and I appreciate your early comment. Hoping that we think beyond just the technologies and to the end uses. I'm wondering if you could offer what you feel like the most important end uses to get right would be. We obviously can't model everything, but what disruption might we see in the energy space across end uses that if the models don't capture, the models aren't good? What would be the top on your list to model well and through this end use space?
Well, that's a holy grail question. I think from an end use perspective, the biggest disruption might be that we have technologies that completely overthrow our market organization of this market. You've all heard about the buzzword of a prosumer and, fine, so that's all fine, but it gives you an idea. The digital technologies would allow peer-to-peer market transactions. And I think this fundamental organizational shift is far more important than any hardware changes, like diffusion of electric cars. I'm thinking, for instance, about comprehensive shared mobility models, not what you have in California, not ride-hailing and not Uber and not, the electric scooters. I mean, real shared mobility, where you have completely point-to-point, on-demand transport demand satisfaction, combining public transport with on-demand taxi fleets, using smaller and larger cars and minibuses, where you basically have exactly the same convenience in the service as you have by using a private vehicle, but you don't need to own a vehicle. This is all provided by an intelligent shared mobility scheme. So this is an example, and there have been studies on this impact, and the impact is enormous. I mean, you reduce congestion by 95% in the cities, you reduce pollution by 90% in the cities, because the vehicle fleet is reduced to 5% of the existing stock. So these are very, very important game-changing possible innovations, I think, in end use. Others might be less game-changing in terms of the technology or the business model. Think about thermal retrofit of buildings. We can build buildings that don't consume energy. This is standard. Any engineer can do it. Any architect can do it. Any construction company can do it, at least in Europe, perhaps not in the US. We have net energy buildings, many university buildings, manufacturing plants, not only single family homes, are now net energy producing buildings. Thus, again, aligning to this potential disruptive change of a prosumer-driven energy system rather than a utility or regulator-driven energy system. So these are a couple of examples. Now, the advantage, if we embrace such a scenario of end-use technologies, my esteemed and distinguished fellow panelists will excuse me if I make this remark now. The word learning curve has been used a little bit too much in this discussion. It's certainly a possible and interesting model to advance over the traditional exogenous technological change, where technologies fall like manna from heaven, as Nordhaus has called it. But it's an incredible primitive model. And it's also completely ill applied in most of the models because it's basically pegged to capacity, which is absolutely absurd because it ignores scale effects from learning effects. It puts it all together. It's all a mishmash. So it makes no sense. If you use a learning curve formulation, you have to put it at the unit level and not at the capacity level. So to correct for differences in scale. Man, this is established, people have done it, but it's not widely perceived and embraced in models. And so quite disappointing, actually. Why does this diffusion of this new idea or this fundamental simple insight is not spreading enough in the community? That said, we need more complex models of understanding how technologies change. And a simple learning curve model, okay, it's better than what we had, but it's still vastly inadequate. We have looked at the drivers of technological change, and some of these drivers are improvement in cost and performance, where a learning curve model works. But there are other fundamental drivers. There are actors and institutions. There is knowledge, the knowledge base, the people who hold the knowledge base, or institutions that need to control the knowledge space in spillovers and standards and so on. There's the necessary resources that need to be mobilized to make innovations work, and not only R&D expenditures. I mean, niche markets investments. Overcoming the value of death, as this is called in the literature, or even Eric's diminishing revenues. I mean, for God's sake, yes, we want to have diminishing revenues, otherwise carbon prices should be much higher than we would actually model and anticipate right now. I mean, getting cleaner energy into the system and making this energy cheaper, I think, is a fundamental holy grail of the system, and so we shouldn't complain too much about diminishing revenues. Of course, we need to look at the profitability of the investing firms, and this needs to be maintained. But in principle, declining revenues is positive. So resource mobilization, absolutely critical. Now, look at any model. Okay, I have a learning curve. Where does the money come from? Who is paying for all of these learning investments? What is not the discount rate? What's the interest rate for these investments? More important than subjective discount rates. What's the risk? What's the cost of capital for these learning investments? In which model this is in? So, a lot. I can give you a laundry list that will expand for more than an hour of what needs to be changed. So we need to move to a different conceptualization where we have really a systematic view of also how the innovation process works. And, was happy to hear from Erin, the importance of institutional settings, which are absolutely key, and forms of market organizations and actors. We have people that design technologies, we have people that manufacture technologies, we have people that use technologies. Where are these people in the models? These people have different rationales. These people have different decision-making algorithms, different objectives, and they all need to work together to push technological innovation. Where are these people in the models? Did we ever talk about them?
So point well taken, Arnulf. So the limitations of learning curves, better than not considering advancement at all, but where are the scale effects? Who is paying? I think this brought to mind Erin's opening comments about how can we use some of this work to properly inform where R&D dollars should be spent, and I think I see a linkage between the two, but we admittedly have a long way to go to capture human behavior and institutions. Eric and Erin, any response, any words of agreement or disagreement with this?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. Yeah, Arnulf, you gave a pretty good laundry list that is a challenging list for people who want to try and put all of that into a model. So I hope that you'd forgive me if I suggested maybe like baby steps in that direction. Moving forward, and I think like some of the ways that we can start to move towards the much better vision that Arnulf outlined would be to, okay, so you have a learning curve in your model, but have you thought about, which parts of your technology might have, kind of exogenous effects, maybe materials or something like that would be more or less exogenous to your thing? Have you thought about where, there's scale effects, where there's, international learning, where the learning is more local? Have you broken that out? And I think one thing that we've been getting more interested in ourselves, and I think has been rather informative and makes for interesting models, is more heterogeneity in the demand, in the customers. So instead of modeling demand as a fixed monolithic whole, to see if there are ways, and this is challenging for people who are trying to do this, but see if there are ways to kind of break demand into pieces or groups that might have different preferences, different behavior, different flexibility, or other factors. And then you can often see some interesting things in the interaction between the technology improvements and the demand side.
I could jump in a little bit as well. And everything that Arnulf suggested are all really useful and interesting things. I think we can get a little overwhelmed though when you're like, oh my God, I've got to take GCAM, I've got to include 1,000 new end uses, and then I've got to include the behavior of investors. There's a lot of stuff in there. And so I think, I think we can't have an MES webinar without quoting Alan Mann. And so there is the horses for courses, right? And so I think the question is, what question are you asking? And which of these details need to be in your model to answer this question? And I think to some degree, the way that I've been approaching it is not necessarily, one model that rules them all, but is using multiple models. And so like, Arnulf's talking about the potentially revolutionary impact of shared mobility. So you can study that empirically, you can study that in models that are explicitly aimed at studying the shared mobility, figure out what those impacts are, and then you could think about, is this a specific thing important to put into the GCAM model? And you don't have to model it in detail, you can kind of take the results from the earlier models and put them in. So I think it's just mainly a point that I think we could get a little overwhelmed by putting everything in every model, and I think it's important to really focus on the question we're asking, and then say, okay, are we missing, did I use a learning curve for this result? And a learning curve is really not giving me a valid answer for this result, and then you go back and fix it. So I would just say, keeping the horses for courses, I think, is always an important thing to keep in mind with modeling.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. Thinking, really,
One sentence in response to Erin. This is
of course, Arnulf, please.
But I think omitted variable bias is a serious issue, and of course you can outsource it. This is not a problem, but you cannot ignore it because the system is interdependent. Of course you can say, oh, I'm only interested in electricity markets, blah, 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 blah. But what happens in mobility will influence the electricity demand in the future. That will change the load curve significantly, that offer storage capabilities. The capacity of batteries will be larger than the capacity of all power plants combined in terms of power, not in terms of energy, obviously. I mean, in terms of kilowatt hours, it's peanuts. You can perhaps store one day of electricity demand in the batteries of a completely electrified car fleet. But in terms of power management, it's enormous. So, you cannot ignore these interdependencies. Yeah, okay, outsource the scenario, but you cannot ignore it. So horses for courses is great to say, but in a very strongly interdependent system like we have in energy, we have to be very careful not to say, oh, this is not in my realm because, I model something very, very specific. And I assume that other developments don't affect what I'm modeling, but in most cases, this assumption is not the case. And if you want to look at the biggest, let's say, joker, this is regulation of the carbon price. I know this is an inconvenient truth to speak in the US, where even carbon taxes are a non-word, and my colleagues have to use the social price of carbon instead of taxes. This is the biggest unknown. If you're going to have very high and rapidly increasing carbon prices, everything changes once again. Now, of course, we cannot model how carbon prices will evolve, what are the political processes perhaps, but we need to assume them. And we need to assume a very wide range of uncertain future carbon prices, and some of them might be very, very high, depending on how our societies evolve.
So in the chat, John offered the horses for courses is a Jake Jacoby saying, Alan Mann said, the best way to build a complex model is to build a simple one first, for anyone needing the backstory and the context for that phrase. I think this is that push and pull that we all wrestle with here. The need or the desire to start with a simple model that is tractable, that can be built up to the level of sophistication necessary to ask the question at hand, while still avoiding this omitted variable bias. So how do we know what we don't know? As we approach building these models and outsourcing parts and omitting other parts, there are obviously value judgments in what is in and what is out. How do we as a society, or we as a collection of scholars, how do we approach this in a way that increases the rigor and increases the value? That could be rhetorical, or if anyone wants to jump back into the fray.
Okay, everybody's chickening out. I'm not chickening out. This is a rhetorical question. First, we are not operating as a community. And secondly, research has become completely fragmented. We're all running after contracts, and contracts need to be very, very specific and very narrow and very technical. It's only the people like me who are retired who can ask big philosophical questions and invest private time in going into archives. I spent 5 years in reconstructing real costs of the French nuclear reactor program. Who has this time? Nobody is going to fund you for this. So this objective you have to leave to a couple of people who are crazy enough to invest their private time and as a hobby on this deep understanding of systems. And then try to learn.
Uh-oh. We lost him, huh? Well, I can jump in and this was actually building on what Arnulf was saying, that it's a little bit of a, oh, sorry, we lost you for a second.
So it's I think the community cannot tackle these important questions because that's not the way how we have organized our research. We're doing research very piecemeal and very technical. And so it's almost impossible to do it under prevailing funding.
Yeah. So existing limitations. Eric, what were you going to say on this?
Yeah, I mean, it is related to what Arnulf was saying, but I think it's a little wimpy to say this because we're academics and we just love data, but to some degree, better data on a lot of, cost of things, production of things. Some of this is almost impossible to get. Some of it is just challenging to get, as Arnulf kind of already outlined. But I think that's how we would learn more about the kind of deeply uncertain things we don't know is collecting data and having better data. I know that, we've discussed things like, hydrofracking, right, as a possible low cost, surprise. But, hydrofracking, there's somebody somewhere who was tracking the cost of doing hydrofracking as what's basically an industrial process. It wasn't us, right? But it was probably somebody in a corporation somewhere. They were probably less surprised because they saw those costs coming down. But, it came as a surprise to us because, that wasn't reported, that wasn't shared. And it wasn't something that we could really kind of grapple with and analyze. So, how you get that data, I don't know. You send Arnulf into French libraries for 5 years or other people that are similarly dedicated.
No, I appreciate that. So sometimes it's not available. Sometimes it's not heard. Sometimes that the signals are there, but it defies our conventional knowledge, defies what we think is the reasonable range of outcomes. I was doing power system modeling before the fracking boom, and we really considered a low gas future as something that was so far higher than where we ended up. It was this kind of failure of imagination, and I think we have lots of that happens over and over again, and it's it can be difficult to consider what is sounds extreme at the time. I wonder if we if we can learn from those experiences. Would anyone on the panel be able to offer or share their perspective? Where did we get this? Where did we, and maybe the collective we being predecessors as well, but where do people who think about the energy space really get it wrong? What did we miss? I mean, I think fracking is one example, but are there other big changes that our models or our intuitions or our approach at understanding just absolutely failed, and could we do better next time?
Jump in a little bit. I don't know if I have examples. I mean, fracking is the obvious one, and I actually don't think there were a lot of people that saw that coming. We sat in industry groups and everybody was amazed. But and just what we've seen with the solar and batteries, I mean, those have gone down far more than most people had predicted and than most people had modeled. And what we see in a lot of models is even with these very low costs you have for solar, they still don't respond to those low costs. So I think there's a lot of examples, and I think kind of what you were saying, it's this idea of what's a reasonable change, and I think we need to consider things that are unreasonable. We need to, basically we have great overconfidence, which is something that we deal with in the forecasting, right? Everyone has this just amazing overconfidence, and we need to do a better job of just pushing our boundaries and say, what's crazy? What will never happen? What's impossible? What's crazy? Because it turns, a lot of things that we see just seemed crazy and impossible. And so we need to not put high probability on these crazy things, right? But we need to have them out there and see what they, how they will affect things. And so I think I think there's a general problem of overconfidence, that it's a natural human bias, actually. But I think it would be great if there was some way for us to really, as a community, kind of help people think of these crazy things. You know, think about what would even happen to the model if you put these crazy things in. I mean, does the model just explode, right? It just won't optimize or something like that. So I think that's a, you know, so rather than just examples, I mean, I think that what we can learn is that we have to be less overconfident, have more humility, and really think outside the box.
Great, thank you, Erin. I see a great question from John in the chat. You know, on the issue of you know, relying on others. You know, one researcher or one research group can't do this all. So when we lean on other groups to inform our models, our modelers are responsible for the inputs and parameter value they get from other research communities, or at least communicating that they are doing that and discussing the implications of that. You know, so how do we ethically, how do we responsibly, how do we thoughtfully build upon others, so we are not these little islands, you know, in a way that also keeps quality control?
Well, I have an opinion on that. So my answer is yes, you're definitely responsible for your inputs. And I kind of wish, one of the things that I feel like we should all do more of is, you know, being very clear about what our inputs are, where they came from. But also a thing that I think we could all do better at is kind of, you know, making justifications and arguments for why we chose this versus that, right? Sometimes you only have one source for data, and maybe that's your source, and that's why. Sometimes you have multiple sources and you think they're all legitimate, and you're going to take some sort of average or central figure. We've in the past done a different thing. We've had multiple sources and said, actually, this one that's on the fringe, we just think they're doing a better job, that they've, you know, been more accurate in the past. And even though that they have kind of a fringe opinion, that we think their modeling approach is better, and they've had good performance in the past. And so we're going with that data. So I think, you know, that decision is a relevant one and should be justified. The reader doesn't have to agree with you. Not all the readers will agree with you, but I think it's a service to communicate what you've done, to communicate why you've done it. And it helps people understand and helps people decide how they want to interpret the results from your work.
Yeah, and I think this closely relates to another comment that John has in the chat. And I mean, effectively, this is a motivation for the formation of the macro energy systems community and other communities like this, where you develop relationships, you develop trust, you develop methods of quality control and methods of sharing. And I think all of those are very, very positive you know, arguments for community building. We need to be careful, you know, to Erin's point too, that we need to make sure that as a community we don't develop overconfidence, and we retain the humility necessary to consider that crazy things will happen, and big events that are unanticipated, so we don't fall into groupthink. It's a challenging tightrope to walk. We have a question from an anonymous attendee that I think relates nicely to this. And so the question is, how do you account for short-term disruptions? You know, for example, the war in Ukraine. Is it possible? Can models be trained on historical data that see disruptions like that instead of, you know, these nice, beautiful, smooth forward curves? How do we consider these large step function change that have big impacts on our energy systems?
I mean, I can give a short answer to that. How, you know, one of the simpler ways that I think is pretty accessible is, instead of having, you know, sort of fixed inputs for an input that might be kind of variable, to have a sort of mean regressing, you know, random walk to it and run multiple times with a random walk. So we've done this, for example, with natural gas price, right, which is, you know, kind of famously variable. And so, you know, it kind of dances around some mean value when we run the model multiple times with different kind of future dances to see how that happens. Now, we weren't intending to take into account large disruptions with that, but you could just as easily use the same strategy and include kind of large disruptions infrequently and see how that, kind of affects your results. And what you tend to see, unsurprisingly, is that models try and give you results that are more robust against that type of disruption, which, is exactly what you would probably want to see in response to that modeling.
Let me add, there is also another possibility, and that's the good old scenario technique. You can assume in a scenario a very, very fundamental, rapid disruptions. Let's say all of a sudden you are no longer allowed to import gas. Okay, you can make this assumption. You could do a scenario. I have an embarrassing anecdote from the history of YASA. There was a scenario study coordinated by Bill Clark in 1987, where a group of very wise people assembled in Sweden and made scenarios on the future development of Europe. And there was one scenario that postulated the collapse of the communist East and of the Soviet Union. Nobody wanted to hear about it. It was not even published at YASA. People were too much afraid to even publish it. Now, a very simple example of an interesting scenario postulating a very rapid short-term disruptive change, which you then can analyze with existing models. It's not that complicated. So in addition to, of course, Erin, you can add a lot of fancy stuff and, stochastic perturbation, particularly for very volatile phenomena like prices, but you can also use the good old scenario technique. But it means you need to have interesting scenarios. And that means you need to reach out to this community that can formulate these scenarios. One of the biggest mistakes, I think, is that the scenarios have been relegated to technical modeling protocols, particularly within the IPCC. These are not interesting scenarios to look at all. They're all surprise-free. 2 degrees warming level or 1.5 degree warming level. So this is all very mechanistic. This is not an interesting scenario. But there is a community out there. One can reach out to get interesting storylines of possible disruptive changes.
Arnulf, do you have suggestions, ideas for interesting extreme scenarios and events that you would like to see modeled? Not predictions that will happen, obviously, but just things that might be out there that might be the equivalent of the overlooked scenario in the 1980s at IASA that we should be running now, that might elicit controversy or be very, very unlikely, but also very informative.
I can only give you my personal opinion and my bias. I think the most interesting scenario is a scenario of very rapid social change. It's one of the prejudices of engineers that they think technological systems are malleable, but social systems are not. And the social scientists generally, not always, but tend the opposite. So I think, but from what I have seen in the scenario literature, this is an area which is not very much explored. There are scenarios, particularly in the geopolitical sphere, that are very disruptive, but they're all sour scenarios, fortress world, or this type of scenarios. For me personally, I'm not that convinced that this is something very interesting to explore with models. But I think a scenario in which you have very drastic changes could be very interesting in models. I mean, we've done an exercise at YASA in which we have postulated that demand actually decreases in absolute terms, minus 40% reduction in energy demand by 2050. What happens? Well, you can meet 1.5 and you don't need any BECCS. That's what happens. So these are the type of interesting scenarios, and I think they all come from changes, radical changes in social preferences and behaviors, and even consumption patterns. Now, do we see that in empirical data? Yes, we do. In the population of the city of Stockholm, Amongst the people below age 24, only 10% have a driver's license. Now, that's a very rapid technological change. Presumably all on your university campuses, I'm not so sure you can get a lot of meat anymore. It's all vegetarian and vegan, at least in Europe. And not only in campuses, also in social, arts sphere, theaters, diets are changing very rapidly. We don't see it in the aggregate statistics on per capita consumption of the US. Obviously, this is very, very stratified and heterogeneous. But we have it in empirical data that behaviors and preferences change. And that would be an interesting scenario to look at. Not in Europe, because people are doing that, but definitively in the US, because I'm not aware of a single study that has done this for the US.
Excellent. Thank you, Arnulf. I unfortunately have to say that we have run out of time. I'm getting the signal that we need to wrap up, but I would like to thank this incredible panel. I think that the perspectives offered are extremely valuable for the MES community, and I really just appreciated the lively discussion. There was a question about when the workshop would be. I don't think that has been set, but Polly, is the direction for?
Well, just one thing is, I think we're really trying to pull the MES community together at the IEW, which is June, I think, next year, outside of Denver. So we're not going to have a workshop this summer. It'll be the following summer. So where are we? It won't be 2023, it'll be 2024. In 2023, we're hoping MES will meet at IEW, so I will throw in a plug for that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Erin. And thank you all. We appreciate your participation today.
Thanks, Jeremiah.